Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Every year, the annual gathering of political and business leaders coming from across the world makes headlines. But this year was not like previous ones. We have had multiple leaders making grand statements or controversial statements about the state of the world we find ourselves in 2026. Of course, the most important one that is being cited far and wide is the one made by Mark Carney from Canada, where he has spoken about the rupture in world order and given a rousing call for the middle powers to come together. Trump, in his long speech, went from everything about Greenland to windmills. Then we have also interestingly had the European Commission President Ursula talking about the free trade agreement that's being negotiated with India and saying that, it will be like the mother of all deals. So that's quite interesting from an Indian point of view. Now, with so much happening, I think it's very important to, simplify it, decode it, put it in a framework, and think about what all of this means going forward, especially for Indian interests, but also generally the state of global affairs. So I have with me Manoj Kewalramani, who is heading the Indo-Pacific Programme at Takshashila and is a prolific China researcher. And I'm Lokendra. I work with the High-Tech Geopolitics Program here at Takshashila. So Manoj, let me start with a very simple question. I'm sure you have read the Mark Carney speech fully and maybe multiple times already. So what are your impressions of what he spoke?
Hey, so my sense is if you look at what happened in Davos was that, firstly, after a long time, and this is probably what Trump does, is that it makes events like the World Economic Forum gathering more newsworthy, more sexy in some ways. Otherwise, it's usually quite dry. So, at least Trump brings that celebrity and craziness, which makes some of these things engaging. Obviously, not in a good way, given the direction of the world right now. As far as Mark Carney's speech goes, I think it was in some ways, it was an honest speech. It was quite straightforward. It was quite blunt. And I think the message that he was delivering was quite direct, which is what made it stand out. The fact that this was the Canadian Prime Minister and not a European leader delivering this speech is what made it even more stark, the message that he was delivering. But in some ways, it's not surprising that this was an American neighbor delivering this speech, given the last year of diplomacy that we've seen, where the US has essentially used coercion across the board with allies, partners, adversaries, and been much harsher on allies and partners than its adversaries, to try and fashion what it thinks is a return to a 19th century world order of some kind. So it's therefore not surprising. Also, if you think from a not realistic, but from a realist vision of the world, once the great power next door starts to coerce, you will look for balancing options. The success of the US over the last 70, 80 years has fundamentally been that it has not necessarily needed to coerce to achieve, partners to work with it. It's not necessarily needed to coerce also as much neighbors like Canada. And today that's shifting. So therefore, you're seeing a pragmatic realignment that the Canadians are thinking about. What it means for middle powers, I mean, look, sitting in India, what Mark Carney said is something that I think the Indian establishment and the Indian intelligentsia has been talking about ever since independence, I would argue. The idea of non-alignment and then alignment and now multi-alignment. is essentially that you're living in a world of realpolitik. India doesn't do alliances, and therefore India needs to figure out ways to work with different entities and to diversify its partners and to reduce risk.
Hmm.
Um, so I don't think it's particularly new for countries across the developing world
Yeah.
to think of it from this perspective.
Hmm.
It's striking because it's a country which is core to the American alliance system,
Yeah.
which is making this argument, and that's why it's striking.
And also, I think, Manoj, the idea that in his speech, he's essentially calling out the hypocrisy of rules based order that Canada itself benefited from. And he's accepting some of these things, right, in a very honest way and saying it doesn't work for us anymore. So we are going to try something different and we are going to get all the middle powers together. One more thing that stands out to me, and I'm not sure how much changes will it bring to international diplomacy over the long term, is the level of honesty Trump has brought about in international conversations. As in, earlier diplomatic conversations used to be very boring, very, people are very careful with the kind of words they used, how they described their partnership, relationship, state of the world, and so on. Now, even Mark Carney or the way I think Macron spoke or the way Ursula spoke, it seems to me that world leaders are becoming more attuned to using a language that resonates more with the masses. Maybe in the long term, this will mean some shifts in how diplomacy is also conducted. That's another tangent I went on this. But specifically on what it means for India, what Mark Carney spoke. So Mark Carney has already taken some steps in divergence from his predecessor in realigning India-Canada relationship after some troubling years. So do you think this speech means a re-emphasis on the partnership with India, and any pointers as to which areas would they prioritize going forward?
Let me begin with the idea of honesty. I don't think it's a case of countries or leaders being much more honest. I think that if you read between the lines of diplomacy, the idea that you talk within a certain paradigm allows for conversation to happen and even harsh conversation to happen. Yes, he's more blunt. He was more blunt at this point of time, which I think is a reflection of the frustration and the kind of shock that is being experienced across Western Europe and Canada and basically across countries that are US allies in terms of the changes in American policy. I don't think that you will necessarily see countries continuously making such public statements or leaders making such public statements. I think you can be much more candid without necessarily being as blunt all the times. And I don't assume Mark Carney will be blunt every time.
Okay.
His point of, the rules-based order and the hypocrisy of the rules-based order. Look, anybody who looks at the world has always known that there is hypocrisy in the world. That's just the nature of how global politics functions. This is the time when it's biting the West because of the way the United States is behaving. Once this period shifts to some other sort of equilibrium, I don't think we'll go back to the old equilibrium, but once it shifts to some other sort of new equilibrium, you will have certain rules for the rules of the road, and some countries around the world will find those hypocritical, irrespective. So I don't think that there is something particularly uniquely new that will be created that will not be hypocritical.
Okay.
Depending on hypocrisy is a matter of where your vantage point is and what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
But hypocrisy is fundamentally inherent to the global system, so that's likely to remain. Now, in terms of what all the other leaders that you mentioned, whether it was Emmanuel Macron, whether it was Ursula von der Leyen, whether it is Mark Carney or the others, and I think we need to understand from a framework perspective the nature of the world order today. We are going through a process in which some have called this world disorder, some have called this as a world between orders, some have called this world as sort of moving towards a new Cold War between the US and China and Russia and things like that. Some have called this sort of some sort of a new, like I said earlier, a 19th century framework of a concert of great powers, which I presume Trump is keenly, somewhat interested in.
With spheres of influence.
Where spheres of influence exists, and and then you think of who the great powers might be.
Yeah.
So, I think it's useful to think about what kind of world we are moving in. And I agree that I don't think there is any decisive sort of outcome as of now. What we are is that we are sort of in between orders. And the way I see it is that we are in a place where you are seeing great power rivalry between China and the United States. And you are seeing a bunch of middle powers amidst that great power rivalry trying to hedge for more autonomy, more opportunity, and more freedom of action, sort of more maneuverability. And that creates a world which is quite difficult. The other component of this framework of great power competition in an emerging multipolar world is the idea that neither great power truly has the capabilities or the legitimacy to try and shape the world in the direction that they want to. And I don't think even neither of the US or China have a revolutionary zeal to overthrow the institutional structure that exists. Even if there may be some revolutionary elements within each administration, they are limited by their power constraints, domestic politics, and things like that. In fact, I disagree with Mark Carney. I don't think we're seeing a rupture around the world. I think what we're seeing is a transition. It's a very chaotic transition, but it's a transition. I don't think it's a rupture. I don't think we're in revolution. A rupture to me is when you see the UN being jettisoned, you see NATO being dismantled, you see some of these things happen. We are not there. We might get there, but we are not there. So that's where I look at the world as. The final point on your bit about what do you think
India and Canada.
India and Canada can do together? I think there are many areas, right? From human capital to technology. There are many, many areas where the two countries can work.
I think nuclear is a very fantastic example.
So there are many sectors where both sides can work together. The recognition in Canada that you need to diversify and that you need to function more from an interest perspective than simply from a perspective of prioritizing democratic values, norms, and things like that, or your version of those norms.
Correct.
Is to me is a good outcome. It'll facilitate more pragmatic engagement between the two sides and less judgment.
And more of acceptance of Indian interests also, right?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
I don't know about that, and I won't prejudge that there would be a direct acceptance of more. But I think there would be probably a far more willingness to accommodate different things because you recognize that it is in your interest to accommodate.
Okay. Understood. So let's move to the next part, which is around Trump. And in his long speech, as I had mentioned previously, he spoke about so many things: Denmark, Greenland, then Europe, renewable energy, and he had particular thing about windmills, Iceland, Switzerland, Somali immigrants, federalism. And I'm just reading from a wonderful story New York Times has done, which is very nicely titled, "Here's a look at everything and everyone Trump has targeted at Davos." So out of a long list of things Trump has targeted, what stood out to you?
I mean, to me, honestly, nothing about the speech stands out, partly because there's nothing new.
Okay.
These are sort of campaigns, stump speeches, complaints, grievance politics that Trump has had for a very long period of time. I think the fact that he committed that he will not use force to take Greenland, I think that is something that is useful for the Europeans, that he will not do that, and useful from an Indian perspective because it tells you that NATO is likely to sustain. It also reinforces the argument that I was making, that as much as there might be some zeal for revolution in some quarters, there are limitations to what even the US might end up doing in such cases. And now he could obviously tomorrow send in the forces and completely repudiate what I'm saying. But I think that there are limitations, and I think that's what comes across. I think it also is a recognition that it matters what allies and partners say, think, and do, because your interests are much broader than what sort of the media headlines on one particular issue might indicate. So to me, nothing particularly stood out. I think that he's, like I said in the beginning, that he's made these things much more newsworthy, and, we talk about these things much more, but he's actually, the politics that he has brought about is interesting to the extent that it has set the cat among the pigeons. There is some reorganization and restructuring of the world that is seriously happening right now. But at the same time, from a policy perspective of a leader bringing in some sort of policy perspective, I don't think what you can take away, because these are just expressions of grievances. And several of those grievances are not even based in reality.
Sure. So on this Greenland bit, and I would like us to stay on this subject for a bit more time. What Trump cited was, although I think he spoke mistakenly Iceland, but he meant Greenland, but he cited that the markets went down and they lost US lost a lot of money or things like that. And then this has reignited conversations around TACO coming back. TACO is like Trump always chickens out, coming back. Now, few days back, right after Venezuela had happened, the kind of narrative that is coming out from the US indicated that the days of TACO were done. And in 2026, the administration is going to do FAFO. Now, FAFO, please, listeners, Google it. There's a cuss word involved in it, so we won't spell it out for you. But there was an impression that 2026 will be defined by FAFO. Venezuela was the first one. Then you'll have Iran, which was quite imminent, right? The US is about to attack, and then it didn't happen. Trump did take the off ramp. And then on this Greenland thing also has now clearly said he's not going to use force. He has ruled it out in a very clarifying manner. And so TACO is again back in fashion. People are saying that, market is something that gets Trump to back off. So I want to test this theory with you, as in ask you whether you think markets are the only guardrail against Trump, and are markets the only thing that keep FAFO in check and keep TACO still relevant? Yeah.
I think you're asking me an impossible question. I think that, look, if you listen to what Trump himself said, he said that he is only limited by his own morality.
Yes.
When it comes to doing things, right?
Yes.
So do the markets matter? Yes, they do. Do bond yields matter? Of course they do. Are they decisive? How much should the market move for him to change his mind? I don't know. I don't know if it is even possible to know. What is the figure at which bond yield has to change for him to change his mind? I don't know. But clearly, there are people within the administration who may not be comfortable with the nature of policy. And there are different people within the administration who may be pushing for certain kinds of policy. If you actually look at Venezuela, to me, what has been achieved in Venezuela is basically the abduction of Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and there is nothing else. The regime stays in place, the regime's elements stay in place. Is it a given that American oil companies are going to go and make money? No.
Depends.
It depends. If you looked at the meeting that he had with the oil companies, there was significant...
They were reluctant.
So there is hesitation. It's not going to be so straightforward.
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
If you look at Iran, yes, the US can bomb Iran, but there will be retaliation. There will be costs to that bombing. There can easily be an escalatory ladder. And that escalatory ladder can end up with US boots on the ground. That can have significant complications, not just from an American security point of view, but also from domestic politics point of view. Given that a reasonable chunk of the MAGA base itself is quite fed up with American boots on the ground in the world, in different parts of the world. So it's not a straightforward decision. Secondly, what's the objective of the bombing? Do you want the regime to collapse? Will the bombing? So it's a complicated decision to make. The third thing is on Greenland. You can see that there are clearly people in the administration who are uncomfortable with the idea of this being the hill on which NATO dies. Right. So I think that we need to sort of step back a little bit. I think, yes, Trump is limited only by his own perhaps imagination and maybe morality. But I think there are also broader concerns that he has in terms of what's the impact on the economy? How is that likely to impact elections within the US, particularly midterm elections? I don't know if he intends to run for a third term and if he intends to create, a constitutional crisis in the US. If he does, he probably will be concerned about some of these political outcomes. So I think it is the calculus is likely to be much more complex than simply the markets. But some evidence tells you that bond yields make a difference because bond yields are related to US borrowing. And under Trump, what we have seen despite Doge and all last year, I was looking at data and, the Trump administration's expenditure is about 4% more than what the Biden administration spent in its final year. So Doge has not led to cuts in overall spending. It has led to cuts in specific sectoral spending.
And some of them are arguably ideological driven.
So let's not even get into that. In terms of overall expenditure, the US is still spending more than what it was a year.
Basically reprioritization of spending, but the overall...
It's still spending more. So it will need to borrow more. He wants to increase the defense budget to $1.5 trillion. He will need to spend more. So you will need to borrow more.
Yeah.
If you're borrowing at higher bond yield, it's a problem.
Yeah.
If you create an environment in which your partners and allies stop buying your bonds or are unwilling to buy your bonds or want to dump some of your bonds, all of that creates a problem for the US from an economic perspective.
There's some reports, I'm not fully sure, but about some countries withdrawing some sort of investment in US treasuries.
The Canadians have apparently shifted some bit of it. But the idea is
was that in US treasuries or something else?
So the idea is that if you are going to go down a road where your debt becomes risky for other countries, and particularly your allies whom you depend on, then it's the challenge, right? So I think it's several factors that lead you to make certain decisions rather than just simply where the markets move.
Okay. So let's move to the final leg of our conversation about India, what India would be particularly looking to, right? We covered that briefly when we covered Canada also. But I think the most significant statement that has come out is European Union President Ursula's one where he called what they're negotiating with as the mother of all deals. And this is uncharacteristic, in my view, in my limited knowledge, for a European Union to describe their deal with India. So how do you interpret it? Do you foresee it being signed by the end of this month itself?
So, I mean, it seems evident that the deal will get done by in the next week or so when you have European leaders visiting for the Republic Day in India. So that deal is likely to get done. Not just a trade deal, but also a defense and security agreement is also likely to get done. I think the EU foreign policy chief mentioned that also. So clearly there is, this congruence of interest and, this is the free trade agreement in particular has been negotiated for a very long time. So what we're seeing is that there is a Congress of interest which is now materializing into action. And that is a good thing. I think both Europe and India need to work together for the purpose of diversity, but also for the purpose of opportunity in both in India and across Europe. So I think that's a positive. I mean, that's one positive outcome that I think the US policies since Trump 1.0, I think have facilitated. And, in Trump 2.0, they've accelerated this agenda of trying to find an alignment and trying to negotiate away some of the difficult issues. What do I make of Ursula von der Leyen's comment about this being the mother of all deals? Look, it could be that it is a substantive economic agreement. It could also be the fact that this is a huge deal which has been going on for a very long period of time, which is being negotiated between two very complex and difficult bureaucracies.
Yeah.
And you've been able to get that agreement in itself tells you that it is extremely significant. So that mother of all deals can be about, yes, the quality of the deal and what it could result in terms of trails, but it could also just mean, you could read it also as a big sigh of relief, that we're finally here and we're finally getting this agreement. And I think a free trade agreement between India and Europe is a good deal. I think it is something that we should get. I think it is, again, I don't know the details of the agreement. Once it is made public, we'll know. I'm sure there'll be lots of criticism on several grounds.
But the idea itself is good.
I think it is good. I think the fact that India is embracing... from an Indian point of view, I think once we stepped out of the RCEP, there was a certain aversion to free trade agreements. There was lots of narrative in India about how, and justifiably so, about how previous FTAs have not served India well with East Asian countries, and they've been underutilized. And there are several reasons why they've been underutilized. A lot of them to do with how the Indian government has informed traders, how traders have engaged, and so on and so forth.
And fear of China was also lurking in the background.
In RCEP. But in terms of the underutilization of our trade deals with other countries, I think that India needs to do a lot more internally to try and utilize the free trade agreements that we have. But after RCEP, there was this narrative of free trade agreements maybe are not for India. I'm really happy that over the last 5-6 years, that narrative has gone away. And we are back to a point where we are negotiating free trade agreements. The deal with Australia, the deal with the UAE, the deal with ECTA, the European countries, Liechtenstein and those countries. I think it's really, really important that we are back to doing this and that we are negotiating these free trade agreements. I think it is important for India to have access to world markets, global capital, global talent, and technology. To be able to do that, you need to be engaging in freer trade. So I think I'm happy that this is happening. We can negotiate, individual elements of that, whether government procurement should be open,
Yeah.
to what extent should it be open, who benefits from all of that. I think we can negotiate and we can address. But I think in principle, it is a good thing that we are negotiating more free trade agreements with Europe, and hopefully sooner rather than later, there will be a deal with the US which will stick.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Manoj. I think we have covered quite some ground in the last 25-30 minutes of this podcast. So thank you so much to our listeners as well for bearing through with us. If you have any thoughts or questions about what Mark Carney spoke, do you think it's a rupture? Do you think it's a transition, as Manoj had put it? Please let us know your thoughts. And the larger question, does Trump make everyone more honest or blunt? Please do let us know. These are larger questions to think about. Thank you so much, Manoj.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.